What happens when someone with the highest military clearance in the country is forced to hide in plain sight? The answer lies in a small-town emergency dispatch center in Montana, where a woman who had coordinated classified operations across 3 continents was answering 911 calls about lost cats and noise complaints. Dismissed, underestimated, but never truly powerless. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Catherine Mitchell had perfected the art of being unremarkable. At 31, she moved through the Clearwater County Emergency Dispatch Center like a ghost in fluorescent lighting, her presence so understated that most people forgot she was there within minutes of meeting her. The night shift suited her perfectly. Fewer questions, fewer curious glances, fewer people wondering why someone with her obvious intelligence was answering emergency calls in a town of barely 8,000 people. Her workstation occupied the far corner of the dispatch floor, deliberately chosen for its isolation. 3 monitors displayed county maps, emergency protocols, and call logs in soft blue light that cast shadows across her face. The headset she wore had been issued to her 6 months ago when she'd started the job, but it felt foreign against her ears. A dramatic downgrade from the military-grade communication equipment she'd grown accustomed to during 12 years of service most people would never know about. The coffee maker in the break room gurgled constantly, producing a bitter brew that bore no resemblance to the precision-crafted beverages she'd enjoyed in secure facilities, from Quantico to classified locations she could never name. Everything about civilian life felt muted, softened, smaller somehow. But that was exactly what Sarah needed after the catastrophic end to her military career, a place where nobody asked difficult questions, and where her biggest challenge was staying awake during the graveyard shift. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, treated her with the kind of patronizing kindness reserved for people who clearly couldn't handle anything more demanding. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of emergency services, proud of her local expertise, and deeply suspicious of outsiders who might think they knew better. She'd made it clear from Sarah's first day that prior experience elsewhere didn't necessarily translate to understanding how things worked in Clearwater County. The thing about small-town dispatch, Morrison had explained during Sarah's orientation, is that it's all about relationships and local knowledge. You can't just follow procedures from some manual. You need to understand the community, know the personalities, recognize the voices. That takes time to develop. Sarah had nodded politely, not mentioning that she'd once coordinated tactical communications for operations involving hundreds of personnel across multiple time zones, where a single mistake could compromise national security or cost lives. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now considered a novice because she couldn't immediately identify every caller's voice or remember which house on County Road 47 had the aggressive dog. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of benevolent neglect and subtle condescension. They were decent people, hardworking and dedicated to serving their community, but they saw Sarah as someone who'd probably washed out of whatever bigger aspirations she'd once harbored. The assumption seemed to be that people ended up in Clearwater County Dispatch because they couldn't cut it anywhere else. Tom Bradley, the day shift supervisor, had made his assessment clear during Sarah's second week. No shame in finding your level, he'd said with what he probably thought was encouragement. Not everyone's cut out for high-pressure work. Emergency dispatch can be plenty challenging once you get the hang of it. The other dispatchers were friendly enough, but in the careful way people are with someone they perceive as fragile or potentially incompetent. They'd offer unsolicited advice about handling difficult callers, share stories about local quirks she should be aware of, and generally treat her like a newcomer who needed extensive guidance to avoid making embarrassing mistakes. Sarah let them believe what they needed to believe. It was easier than explaining why someone with her background had chosen to disappear into small-town anonymity. The truth was complicated, painful, and classified in ways that made honest conversation impossible. Better to be underestimated than investigated. Her apartment reflected the same deliberate ordinariness as her professional persona. A modest one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to single professionals and retirees, furnished with pieces from the local furniture store that prioritized practicality over style. The walls were bare, except for a few generic landscape prints that had come with the rental. No photographs, no awards, no memorabilia from her previous life. But in the bedroom closet, hidden behind winter coats she rarely needed in Montana's dry climate, sat a locked metal case that told a different story entirely. Inside were commendations from agencies whose names were redacted, photographs from operations she could never discuss, and documentation of clearances at levels most people didn't know existed. The case also contained her old identification cards and badges, tangible proof of a career that had taken her to the highest levels of national security operations. The radio call sign that had defined her identity for over a decade was embossed on several items in that case, Nighthawk 7. To those who knew, it represented one of the most trusted communication coordinators in Special Operations history. Someone who'd maintained contact with teams in hostile territory, coordinated complex multi-agency operations, and earned the absolute confidence of commanders who didn't give trust easily. Nighthawk 7 had been the voice in the darkness for operators who depended on perfect communication to survive. She'd guided rescue missions through diplomatic minefields, coordinated intelligence operations across international boundaries, and maintained operational security in situations where a single compromise could trigger international incidents. But that person no longer existed officially. The career that had defined Sarah's identity for 12 years had ended abruptly 18 months ago, in a classified incident that she was legally prohibited from discussing. The details were buried in files marked with security classifications that would remain sealed for decades. All Sarah could say, even to herself in quiet moments, was that she'd been scapegoated for decisions made by people with more political protection and less honor. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Without military structure, professional identity, or the intense purpose that had driven her for over a decade, Sarah had felt completely unmoored. The skills that made her exceptional in her previous role, attention to detail, ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously, calm decision-making under extreme pressure, seemed almost irrelevant in the civilian world. She'd tried other jobs first. Corporate security consulting felt hollow and profit-driven compared to serving national interests. Private investigation work was mostly insurance fraud and cheating spouses, a far cry from the complex high-stakes operations she'd managed. Every potential career path seemed to require either explanations she couldn't give or recommendations from people she was no longer allowed to contact. Emergency dispatch had appealed to her precisely because it was removed from anything resembling her former life. It was honest work that served the community without requiring her to navigate the complex politics and moral ambiguities that had ultimately destroyed her military career. The pay was modest but sufficient for her simple lifestyle, and the work itself was straightforward enough that she could perform it competently while keeping her real capabilities carefully hidden. Most nights passed quietly in Clearwater County. Sarah would handle routine calls, minor traffic accidents, domestic disturbances, medical emergencies that were usually less serious than they initially sounded. She'd dispatch appropriate responders, update incident logs, and maintain the steady, professional demeanor that effective emergency communication required. Her colleagues gradually began to appreciate her reliability, even if they continued to view her as somewhat limited in potential. She never panicked, never made mistakes in protocol, and handled difficult callers with a calm competence that was rare in someone so new to the role. But they attributed these qualities to natural temperament rather than extensive training and experience. What they didn't realize was that every call Sarah handled was processed through mental frameworks developed during years of high-stakes operations. When someone called about a suspicious person in their neighborhood, Sarah automatically assessed the information for tactical significance while simultaneously following standard dispatch protocols. When coordinating multiple emergency responders, she drew on experience managing far more complex operational logistics than anything Clearwater County was likely to present. The hardest part wasn't the work itself. It was the constant need to underperform deliberately. Sarah had to resist the urge to suggest more efficient procedures, ask probing questions that might reveal additional threats or complications, or demonstrate the kind of situational awareness that would immediately mark her as someone with advanced training. She'd learned to modulate her voice to sound appropriately concerned but not overly authoritative, to ask obvious questions that established her as someone still learning the ropes, and to defer to more experienced colleagues even when she could see they were missing important details or making suboptimal decisions. The deception wasn't malicious, it was survival. Sarah had learned the hard way that standing out, Demonstrating exceptional capability or challenging established hierarchies could be extremely dangerous for someone in her position. Better to be forgettable than memorable, competent than exceptional, reliable than remarkable. But late at night, during the quiet hours when emergency calls were rare and her colleagues were focused on paperwork or personal conversations, Sarah sometimes found herself staring at the radio equipment and remembering what it felt like to be Nighthawk 7. To be the voice that people trusted completely, the communication coordinator who could make split-second decisions that affected operations across continents. Those memories were dangerous. They reminded her of who she'd been before everything went wrong, before her career was destroyed by people who'd used her dedication against her. They made her current situation feel even more like exile than refuge. Sarah had accepted that her days of significant responsibility and meaningful impact were over. She'd made peace with being permanently underestimated, with having her most important skills and experiences locked away like state secrets. The person she'd been was gone, and Sarah Catherine Mitchell, night shift dispatcher in rural Montana, was who she needed to be now. What she didn't know was that sometimes the past has a way of finding you, regardless of how carefully you've hidden from it. And when it does, the very skills you've tried to bury become the only things standing between disaster and salvation. The radio call that would change everything was still weeks away, but the stage was already set. In a small dispatch center, where everyone assumed they knew exactly who Sarah Mitchell was and what she was capable of, the most qualified person in the building was about to discover that some secrets are too important to keep buried forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Clearwater County Emergency Services Building had been constructed in 1987 with the kind of optimistic government funding that assumed technology would remain static for decades. 36 years later, the dispatch center operated with a patchwork of updated equipment grafted onto outdated infrastructure, creating a system that worked adequately for routine operations but revealed its limitations during anything remotely complex. Chief Robert Hammond ruled this domain with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through local knowledge and common sense. At 58, he'd spent his entire career in emergency services within a 100-mile radius of Clearwater County, rising through the ranks based on his understanding of local politics, his ability to manage budgets, and his reputation for keeping things running smoothly without unnecessary complications. Hammond's office occupied the corner of the building with the best view of Main Street, where he could monitor the pulse of his community through plate glass windows that he'd personally selected during the last renovation. The walls displayed 30 years of certificates, awards, and photographs, documenting his rise from patrol officer to emergency services coordinator. Every frame told the story of a man who'd built his authority through persistence, local connections, and an instinctive understanding of how power worked in small towns. The morning after Sarah's first-month evaluation, Hammond called her into his office with the kind of formal courtesy that immediately signaled trouble. He gestured to a chair positioned deliberately to face the light, an interrogation technique he'd learned decades ago and still employed during difficult conversations. "Miss Mitchell," he began, consulting a thin folder that contained her personnel file, "I've been reviewing your performance reports with Janet Morrison. Your technical scores are adequate, and you haven't made any significant mistakes. That's good." Sarah waited silently, recognizing the setup for criticism disguised as balanced feedback. Hammond's tone carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to being the final word on personnel decisions. "However," he continued, "there are some concerns about your integration with the team. Janet feels you're holding back, not fully engaging with established procedures. She's mentioned that you seem reluctant to ask questions or seek guidance when faced with unfamiliar situations." The accusation was carefully crafted to be difficult to refute. How could Sarah explain that she wasn't asking questions because she already understood the systems better than her supervisors? That her apparent reluctance to seek guidance stemmed from years of being the person others turned to for critical decisions? "I want to be sure I understand the protocols correctly before," Sarah began, but Hammond cut her off with a raised hand. "That's exactly the attitude that concerns us. Emergency services isn't about perfect understanding, Miss Mitchell. It's about decisive action based on training and experience. When you hesitate, when you overthink routine situations, you create delays that could cost lives." Hammond opened her file wider, revealing pages of handwritten notes that Janet Morrison had apparently been keeping since Sarah's arrival. The documentation was meticulous, cataloging every instance where Sarah had performed her duties competently, but without the urgency or collaborative spirit that her supervisors expected. For example, Hammond continued, reading from Morrison's notes, "Last Tuesday's vehicle accident on Highway 2. You dispatched appropriate units and followed protocol exactly. But you didn't radio for backup when the caller became hysterical. Janet had to intervene to ensure proper support was provided." Sarah remembered the incident clearly. The caller had been distressed but coherent, providing accurate location information and vital signs for the injured driver. Sarah had assessed the situation as manageable with standard emergency response, and events had proven her judgment correct. The backup units that Morrison had insisted on dispatching had arrived to find the scene already under control, their presence unnecessary, and their resources wasted. But explaining her reasoning would require Sarah to reveal analytical capabilities that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. Better to accept the criticism and adjust her behavior to match her supervisor's expectations. "I understand," Sarah said simply. "I'll be more proactive about requesting additional resources." Hammond's expression suggested he found her response disappointingly passive. "Miss Mitchell, emergency services requires people who can think on their feet and work effectively as part of a team. We're not looking for someone who simply follows checklists. We need dispatchers who can adapt, communicate, and make judgment calls based on experience." The irony was suffocating. Sarah had spent 12 years making judgment calls that affected operations across multiple countries, coordinating resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and maintaining communication networks that connected field operatives to command structures spanning continents. But in Clearwater County, she was being criticized for insufficient initiative because she didn't panic appropriately during routine emergencies. "I want to give you every opportunity to succeed here," Hammond continued, his tone shifting to what he probably thought was mentoring. "But you need to understand that this isn't a job where you can just coast along doing the minimum. Emergency services demands commitment, passion, and the ability to work within established hierarchies." Established hierarchies. Sarah had navigated command structures that included generals, cabinet officials, and intelligence directors. She'd coordinated operations where a single communication error could trigger international incidents or compromise ongoing missions. But apparently, she lacked the proper respect for the hierarchy of a rural county dispatch center. "Janet has developed an improvement plan for you," Hammond said, sliding a document across his desk. "Additional training sessions, closer supervision, and specific benchmarks for demonstrating the kind of proactive engagement we expect. I suggest you take this seriously." Sarah reviewed the improvement plan with careful attention. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic micromanagement, designed to document her inadequacies while providing legal protection for eventual termination. The benchmarks were subjective enough to ensure failure if her supervisors decided she didn't belong, but specific enough to create the appearance of objective evaluation. Weekly one-on-one sessions with Janet Morrison to discuss communication effectiveness and team integration. Mandatory attendance at monthly training seminars covering topics Sarah could teach more effectively than the instructors. Performance reviews based on demonstrated initiative and collaborative problem-solving. Criteria that could mean anything depending on the evaluator's perspective. "Do you have any questions about these expectations?" Hammond asked, clearly hoping for a simple acceptance that would end the meeting efficiently. Sarah looked up from the document, meeting his gaze directly. For a moment, she considered revealing enough of her background to establish credibility, to explain why his concerns were fundamentally misplaced. But the memory of how her military career had ended stopped her cold. Speaking up, demonstrating exceptional capability, challenging established authority, those were the behaviors that had ultimately destroyed everything she'd worked to build. Better to endure condescending supervision than risk exposure that could lead to far worse consequences. "No questions," Sarah said quietly. "I understand what's expected." Hammond nodded with satisfaction, apparently interpreting her compliance as appropriate deference. "Good. I want you to succeed here, Miss Mitchell. But success requires adapting to our way of doing things, not trying to reinvent procedures that have worked effectively for years." As Sarah left Hammond's office, she felt the familiar weight of enforced mediocrity settling around her shoulders like a suffocating blanket. The improvement plan was designed to keep her under constant scrutiny while ensuring she never demonstrated the full extent of her capabilities. Janet Morrison was waiting outside Hammond's office, her expression mixing professional concern with barely concealed satisfaction. She'd successfully identified and documented the new employee's deficiencies, protecting her department from someone who clearly didn't understand how things worked in emergency services. "Sarah," Morrison said with artificial warmth, "I hope you understand that this is all about helping you succeed. Emergency dispatch is challenging work, and not everyone adapts easily to the pressure and responsibility." Sarah nodded politely, recognizing the patronizing tone she'd heard from dozens of supervisors who assumed they were dealing with someone of limited capability. Morrison genuinely believed she was mentoring a struggling employee, helping someone who'd obviously failed at whatever they'd attempted before landing in Clearwater County. "The training sessions will be very helpful," Morrison continued. "We'll work on decision-making under pressure, effective communication techniques, and proper protocol implementation. By the end of your probationary period, you should feel much more confident about handling complex situations." The condescension was almost suffocating. Sarah had handled complex situations that Morrison couldn't begin to imagine, coordinating tactical communications during operations where split-second decisions affected national security. She'd maintained radio contact with special forces teams in hostile territory, guided intelligence operatives through diplomatic crises, and managed information flows that connected field operations to the highest levels of government. But in the world of Clearwater County Emergency Services, she was considered someone who needed basic training in, quote, decision-making under pressure. The systematic documentation of her supposed inadequacies began immediately. Morrison started keeping detailed logs of every call Sarah handled, noting response times, protocol adherence, and subjective assessments of her communication effectiveness. The scrutiny was constant and exhausting, designed to find flaws in performance that other dispatchers would never be held accountable for. Other team members began treating Sarah differently as word spread about her improvement plan. Conversations would stop when she entered the break room, then resume with pointed discussions about the importance of fitting in and respecting experience. Colleagues who'd been friendly became professionally distant, protecting themselves from association with someone who'd been formally identified as problematic. Tom Bradley, the day shift supervisor, made his assessment clear during a shift change briefing. "Some people just aren't cut out for emergency work," he said, ostensibly addressing the room but clearly referencing Sarah's situation. "It takes a special kind of person to handle the responsibility and pressure. Not everyone has what it takes." The institutional machinery had identified Sarah as a problem to be managed, rather than a resource to be developed. Every interaction was filtered through the assumption that she was fundamentally unsuited for emergency services work, that her apparent competence was somehow deceptive or insufficient. Sarah found herself trapped in a system designed to prove its own assumptions correct. If she performed adequately, it was evidence that close supervision was working. If she exceeded expectations, it suggested she'd been holding back inappropriately. If she made any mistake, however minor, it confirmed that she lacked the natural ability for emergency services work. The isolation was familiar but still painful. Sarah had experienced similar dynamics during the final months of her military career, when political forces had painted her as a liability despite her exceptional service record. The same pattern of manufactured incompetence, documented deficiencies, and systematic exclusion that had ended her previous life was beginning to emerge in Clearwater County. But this time, Sarah was determined not to fight back. She would accept the limitations, endure the condescension, and maintain the low profile that her survival depended on, whatever it took to avoid the kind of attention that had destroyed everything she'd once valued. What she didn't know was that some situations don't offer the luxury of staying invisible. Sometimes circumstances arise that demand exactly the kind of exceptional capability she was working so hard to hide. And when that moment came, the choice between safety and duty would tear apart the carefully constructed anonymity she'd built around herself like tissue paper in a hurricane. The monthly interagency training exercise arrived with all the fanfare of a small-town parade. Representatives from the Montana State Police, U.S. Forest Service, Border Patrol, and National Guard would converge on Clearwater County for 3 days of coordinated emergency response drills. For Chief Hammond, it represented an opportunity to showcase his department's capabilities to colleagues who controlled budgets, equipment allocations, and career advancement opportunities. For Sarah Mitchell, it represented her worst nightmare. The briefing room had been transformed for the occasion, with folding tables arranged in precise rows facing a projection screen that would display tactical scenarios throughout the week. Representatives from each participating agency filed in wearing uniforms that Sarah recognized from her previous life, badges, insignia, and equipment configurations that triggered memories she'd worked hard to suppress. Agent Maria Santos from the Border Patrol caught Sarah's attention immediately. Mid-40s, compact build, eyes that constantly scanned the room with the kind of professional awareness that only came from years of high-stakes operations. Santos wore her authority easily, comfortable with command responsibility in ways that most local officials could never match. Beside her sat Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson from the Montana National Guard, his dress uniform displaying ribbons that Sarah could read like a biography. Combat deployments, specialized training certifications, command positions that indicated someone who'd operated at levels far above anything Clearwater County typically encountered. Captain David Chen from the state police represented a different kind of professionalism, tactical precision combined with investigative experience that spanned multiple jurisdictions. His equipment was pristine, his bearing suggested someone accustomed to high-pressure situations, and his questions during the initial briefing revealed a strategic mind that thought several steps ahead of most local officials. Sarah found herself assigned to a support role during the exercises, monitoring communications and maintaining situational awareness for multiple agencies simultaneously. It was exactly the kind of work she'd excelled at during her military career, but now she had to perform it while appearing appropriately challenged by responsibilities that should have seemed routine. The first exercise simulated a multi-vehicle accident with potential hazardous materials involvement, requiring coordination between emergency medical services, fire department, state police, and environmental specialists. Sarah's job was to maintain radio contact with all units while tracking their positions, status, and resource requirements on digital mapping systems. Within minutes, she'd identified inefficiencies in the communication protocols that were creating dangerous delays and confusion. The radio frequencies being used weren't properly coordinated, causing interference that made critical updates difficult to understand. The mapping software wasn't configured to display real-time unit positions, forcing commanders to rely on verbal descriptions that were often inaccurate or outdated. But pointing out these problems would require Sarah to demonstrate knowledge and expertise that civilian dispatchers weren't supposed to possess. Instead, she followed the established procedures exactly, watching with growing frustration as preventable communication failures complicated what should have been a straightforward exercise. Agent Santos noticed the problems too. During a brief pause in the exercise, she approached Sarah's workstation with the kind of direct intensity that made most people uncomfortable. "You're seeing the same coordination issues I am," Santos said quietly, her voice carrying enough authority to command attention without seeming aggressive. "The frequency management is causing interference, and the mapping delays are creating situational awareness gaps." Sarah looked up carefully, recognizing the test inherent in Santos's observation. "I've noticed some communication difficulties," she replied neutrally, "but I'm still learning the systems." Santos studied her with eyes that had evaluated hundreds of people under pressure. "How long have you been doing dispatch work?" 6 months in Clearwater County, Sarah answered truthfully, leaving out the 12 years of military communications experience that would have made the question irrelevant. "And before that?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Sarah could feel Santos's professional instincts probing for inconsistencies, recognizing someone whose capabilities didn't match their apparent background. This was exactly the kind of scrutiny that Sarah had moved to Montana to avoid. "Various jobs," Sarah said with deliberate vagueness. "Nothing related to emergency services." Santos nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "You have good situational awareness for someone new to this work. Most civilian dispatchers take months to develop the kind of comprehensive picture you're maintaining." The compliment was also an interrogation. Santos had spent her career identifying people who weren't what they claimed to be, and something about Sarah was triggering her professional suspicions. The conversation was interrupted by Chief Hammond's voice calling for the exercise to resume, but Sarah could feel Santos's attention returning to her throughout the afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson presented a different kind of challenge. During the second day's exercise, a simulated search and rescue operation in the National Forest, he positioned himself near Sarah's communication station to observe her coordination techniques. "Interesting approach to resource allocation," he commented, as Sarah guided multiple search teams through overlapping grid patterns. "You're maintaining redundant coverage while avoiding operational conflicts. That's advanced tactical thinking." Sarah's hands paused briefly over her keyboard. Peterson's observation was accurate. She was unconsciously applying military search patterns that optimized coverage while minimizing the risk of teams interfering with each other. But acknowledging his assessment would reveal training that civilian dispatchers weren't supposed to have. "Just trying to be thorough," she replied, deliberately introducing a note of uncertainty into her voice. "I hope I'm not overcomplicating things." Peterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, your coordination is excellent, better than most military communications specialists I've worked with. Where did you learn to think tactically about search patterns?" The question was dangerous because it assumed knowledge that Sarah officially didn't possess. Peterson was testing her response, trying to understand how a small-town dispatcher had developed skills that typically required years of specialized training. "I guess it just seems logical to avoid having teams searching the same areas," Sarah said, maintaining her cover while feeling increasingly exposed. "Logical, yes, but the specific patterns you're using suggest formal training in search and rescue coordination. These aren't intuitive techniques. They're doctrinal approaches that require extensive education." Sarah could feel the conversation spiraling toward territory that would force her to either lie more elaborately or reveal information that could destroy her carefully constructed anonymity. Fortunately, Chief Hammond chose that moment to request a status update that allowed her to redirect her attention to immediate operational requirements. But Peterson's suspicions had been awakened, and Sarah noticed him paying closer attention to her work throughout the remaining exercises. His questions became more probing, his observations more specific, and his professional curiosity more difficult to deflect. Captain Chen from the state police approached the situation differently. Rather than direct questioning, he simply observed Sarah's performance with the kind of systematic attention that investigators brought to complex cases. He noted how quickly she processed information, how efficiently she prioritized competing demands, and how naturally she anticipated needs before they were articulated. During the final exercise, a simulated terrorist incident requiring coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions, Chen positioned himself where he could monitor Sarah's communications directly. The scenario was deliberately complex, designed to stress-test coordination capabilities under extreme pressure. Sarah found herself managing radio traffic for 17 different units, while maintaining situational awareness for an incident that spanned 3 counties and involved potential federal jurisdiction issues. The volume of information was overwhelming for most dispatchers, but Sarah processed it with the kind of effortless efficiency that only came from extensive experience with far more complex situations. Chen watched her coordinate resources with precision that seemed almost supernatural. She anticipated unit movements, identified potential conflicts before they occurred, and maintained communication flows that kept all commanders informed without creating information overload. Her performance was flawless, professional, and completely inconsistent with someone who had 6 months of civilian dispatch experience. "That was impressive work," Chen said as the exercise concluded. "You maintained perfect situational awareness throughout a scenario that would challenge dispatchers with years of experience." Sarah began to deflect the compliment, but Chen continued with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting answers. "I've worked with emergency communications specialists across multiple states, and I've rarely seen that level of operational coordination. Your performance suggests training and experience that goes well beyond civilian emergency services." The statement wasn't a question, but it demanded a response. Sarah could feel her carefully constructed cover story beginning to crack under the weight of professional scrutiny from people who recognized expertise when they saw it. "I appreciate the feedback," she said carefully. "I've been working hard to learn the systems." Chen's expression suggested he found her response inadequate. "Miss Mitchell, with respect, what I observed today wasn't someone learning systems. It was someone with advanced training applying sophisticated techniques that most emergency services personnel never encounter." "Where did you acquire those capabilities?" The direct question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah realized that her attempts to hide her competence had failed completely. These professionals recognized skills that couldn't be explained away with vague references to natural ability or dedicated study. But before she could formulate a response that might preserve her cover, Agent Santos approached the conversation with information that would change everything. "I ran your name through our database," Santos said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that suggested significant discoveries. "The results are interesting." "Very interesting." Sarah felt her stomach drop like a stone. Federal databases contained information that could connect her civilian identity to her classified military background, revealing exactly the kind of connections she'd worked desperately to keep buried. The three federal agents looked at her with new intensity, recognizing that Sarah Mitchell, small-town dispatcher, was about to become someone entirely different. The assumptions they'd made about her background, her capabilities, and her reasons for being in Clearwater County were about to be shattered completely. Sarah realized that her carefully maintained anonymity was dissolving around her like morning mist, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The professionals surrounding her had recognized something that her local supervisors had missed entirely, that she was exactly the opposite of what she appeared to be. The question now wasn't whether her cover would be blown, but how much of the truth would emerge and what consequences would follow. Sarah braced herself for revelations that could destroy the new life she'd built, while simultaneously dreading and anticipating the moment when she might be able to stop pretending to be less than she was. The aftermath of the interagency training exercises created a perfect storm of suspicion and institutional defensiveness that would transform Sarah's already precarious position into something approaching open warfare. Chief Hammond had witnessed his department's civilian dispatcher outperform seasoned professionals from multiple federal agencies, and rather than recognizing this as an asset, he interpreted it as a threat to his authority and an embarrassment to his leadership. The campaign against Sarah began subtly, with administrative changes that appeared routine but were designed to isolate and undermine her effectiveness. Her work schedule was modified without consultation, shifting her from the predictable night shift to a rotating pattern that made it impossible to establish consistent routines or build relationships with specific crews. Operational flexibility, Hammond explained during a staff meeting where Sarah's schedule changes were announced as part of broader efficiency improvements. Emergency services requires adaptability, and our dispatchers need experience working with all shift rotations and personnel combinations. The explanation sounded reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Sarah recognized it as the beginning of systematic harassment designed to create stress and force mistakes. Her new schedule would have her working nights one week, days the next, then split shifts that made adequate rest nearly impossible. Janet Morrison embraced her expanded role as Sarah's supervisor with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The improvement plan that had originally called for weekly evaluations was revised to include daily performance assessments, with Morrison documenting every call, every decision, and every interaction Sarah had with other personnel. Given the concerns raised during the training exercises about your background and qualifications, Morrison explained during their first daily review session, we need to maintain closer oversight to ensure proper protocol compliance and professional development. The concerns Morrison referenced were entirely fabricated. The federal agents had been impressed by Sarah's performance, not troubled by it. But Hammond and Morrison had reframed professional competence as suspicious behavior that required investigation and correction. The documentation Morrison compiled was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation. Every efficient decision Sarah made was recorded as failure to follow established consultation procedures. Her ability to anticipate problems before they occurred was characterized as inappropriate assumption of supervisory responsibilities. When she maintained perfect composure during high-stress calls, Morrison noted insufficient emotional engagement with community crisis situations. Tom Bradley, the day shift supervisor, joined the campaign with the zealousness of someone protecting his territory from perceived invasion. During shift overlap periods when Sarah worked days, Bradley would position himself at her workstation to provide real-time guidance that was actually systematic micromanagement designed to create anxiety and undermine her confidence. Emergency dispatch isn't about showing off technical skills, Bradley would announce loudly enough for other staff to hear whenever Sarah handled a complex call efficiently. It's about following procedures that have been developed through years of local experience. Some people think they know better than established protocols. But that kind of attitude creates dangerous situations. The psychological pressure was constant and deliberate. Sarah found herself under surveillance that documented every bathroom break, every personal conversation, and every moment when she wasn't actively engaged with emergency calls. Morrison created a checklist of professional behaviors that included subjective criteria like demonstrates appropriate deference to experienced colleagues, end quote, shows willingness to learn from constructive criticism. The harassment escalated when Sarah's equipment began experiencing systematic problems that never seemed to affect other dispatchers. Her computer would crash during complex calls, forcing her to restart systems while emergency responders waited for critical information. Radio frequencies would develop static interference when she was coordinating multiple units, making communication difficult and creating delays that could be blamed on her inexperience. When Sarah reported these technical problems, the maintenance staff would investigate and find nothing wrong. Equipment that malfunctioned repeatedly during her shifts would work perfectly when tested by technicians or used by other dispatchers. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, but proving deliberate sabotage was impossible without access to maintenance schedules and equipment logs that she wasn't authorized to review. The social isolation was equally systematic. Other dispatchers began avoiding Sarah during breaks, their conversations stopping when she entered the room and resuming with pointed discussions about loyalty, teamwork, and the importance of not thinking you were better than your colleagues. The message was clear. Sarah was being perceived as someone who threatened the established order by demonstrating capabilities that made others look inadequate. Some people come into emergency services thinking they're going to revolutionize everything, one dispatcher commented loudly during a shift change while Sarah was present. But this isn't the place for showboats or people who can't work as part of a team. We've got procedures that work, and we don't need someone undermining them. Sarah's attempts to maintain professional relationships were rebuffed with increasing hostility. Colleagues who had been cordial during her first months now treated her with suspicion that bordered on paranoia. Any suggestion she made, no matter how minor or helpful, was interpreted as criticism of existing methods or evidence of her inability to fit into the department culture. The most insidious aspect of the campaign was how it forced Sarah to choose between demonstrating competence and maintaining her cover. When complex emergencies arose, she could either handle them efficiently, which would be documented as evidence of her inappropriate behavior, or deliberately perform below her capabilities, which could result in delayed response times that might cost lives. During a multi-vehicle accident that occurred during a winter storm, Sarah faced exactly this dilemma. The incident involved 6 vehicles, potential fatalities, and hazardous road conditions that were preventing emergency responders from reaching the scene quickly. Proper coordination required simultaneous management of ambulances, fire trucks, state police, highway department snowplows, and towing services, while maintaining communication with hospital emergency rooms preparing to receive casualties. Sarah could see immediately that the standard response protocols were inadequate for the scope and complexity of the situation. The resource allocation was inefficient, the communication frequencies were creating interference, and the coordination between agencies was haphazard in ways that would delay critical care for seriously injured victims. But improving the response would require her to demonstrate exactly the kind of advanced coordination capabilities that had already triggered suspicion during the training exercises. Janet Morrison was monitoring the call directly, documenting Sarah's performance in real time, waiting for evidence that she was exceeding her authority or failing to follow proper procedures. Sarah made the choice that her training and conscience demanded. She coordinated the response with precision that transformed a potentially chaotic situation into a model of emergency services efficiency. She established proper communication protocols, optimized resource deployment, and maintained situational awareness that allowed all responding units to work together seamlessly. The response saved lives. 2 critically injured victims received advanced medical care 20 minutes earlier than would have been possible under standard protocols. Emergency responders later commented that it was the best coordinated multi-agency response they'd experienced in years. Morrison documented it as evidence of Sarah's fundamental unsuitability for emergency services work. Subject exceeded her authority by modifying established response protocols without consultation, Morrison wrote in her report. Demonstrated inappropriate assumption of command responsibilities that created confusion among responding units. Failed to follow standard communication procedures, instead implementing unauthorized coordination techniques that were inconsistent with departmental training. The report was a complete fabrication that transformed professional excellence into disciplinary infractions, but it provided the documentation Hammond needed to justify escalating action against someone he now viewed as a direct threat to his authority. The breaking point came during Sarah's next performance review, where Hammond presented Morrison's accumulated documentation as evidence of systematic problems that required immediate intervention. "Miss Mitchell," Hammond said, his voice carrying the formal authority of someone delivering a predetermined verdict, "your performance over the past month has demonstrated serious deficiencies that raise questions about your suitability for emergency services work." "Meh." Sarah listened as Hammond read from Morrison's reports, watching her professional competence being systematically reframed as evidence of insubordination, poor judgment, and inability to work within established hierarchies. Every efficient decision was characterized as a violation of protocol. Every successful outcome was attributed to luck rather than skill. "Furthermore," Hammond continued, "your background remains unclear in ways that create security concerns. The federal agents who observed your work during the training exercises have raised questions about discrepancies between your apparent capabilities and your stated experience." This was a lie. The federal agents had been impressed by Sarah's performance, not concerned about it. But Hammond was using their professional interest as justification for treating her exceptional abilities as suspicious behavior that required investigation. "I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a comprehensive background investigation," Hammond announced with finality. "During this period, you're prohibited from entering the emergency services facility or having any contact with department personnel. The investigation will determine whether you can continue in your position or if termination is necessary." Sarah sat quietly as her career in Clearwater County was systematically destroyed by people who had decided that competence was threatening and excellence was suspicious. The campaign against her had succeeded in its primary objective, eliminating someone whose abilities made others feel inadequate. But what Hammond and Morrison didn't realize was that their victory would be short-lived. The administrative leave that was designed to isolate Sarah from emergency services work would actually position her perfectly for the crisis that was about to engulf Clearwater County. Sometimes the people you push aside are exactly the ones you'll desperately need when everything falls apart. And when that moment came, Sarah Mitchell would discover that some skills are too important to keep hidden, regardless of the personal cost of revealing them. The systematic campaign had achieved its immediate goal of removing Sarah from her position, but it had also created the conditions for a confrontation that would expose the truth about who she really was and what she was truly capable of accomplishing when the stakes demanded nothing less than perfection. Administrative leave felt like solitary confinement for someone who had spent 12 years managing critical communications that connected lives to safety. Sarah's apartment, which had once represented peaceful anonymity, now felt like a prison cell where she counted hours that stretched endlessly between dawn and darkness. Without the structure of emergency dispatch work, even the limited and frustrating version she'd been performing, her days became exercises in surviving psychological isolation that threatened to unravel the careful emotional control she'd maintained for 18 months. The official investigation into her background was being conducted by a private security firm contracted through the county's insurance provider. Hammond had presented it as routine due diligence, but Sarah recognized it as a fishing expedition designed to find anything that could justify her termination. The investigators were thorough but unsophisticated, running standard background checks that would reveal basic employment history without accessing the classified databases that contained her real military record. What they found was exactly what Sarah had constructed: a paper trail of unremarkable civilian employment with gaps that could be explained by standard career transitions. Her military service appeared as a brief stint in administrative support with an honorable discharge due to force reduction. Nothing indicated the true nature of her work or the security clearances that had once given her access to some of the nation's most sensitive operations. But the investigation created a different kind of problem. The attention it generated reached federal databases that flagged Sarah's name for automated monitoring. Computer systems designed to track former personnel with high-level clearances noted that someone was asking questions about Sarah Catherine Mitchell, and that information was forwarded to agencies that maintained interest in her whereabouts and activities. Agent Maria Santos received the notification on a Thursday morning while reviewing routine intelligence reports at her Denver field office. The automated alert was brief but significant. background investigation initiated on former classified personnel. Subject: Sarah Mitchell. Location: Clearwater County, Montana. Requesting agency: Local Law Enforcement Contract Security. Santos remembered Sarah immediately. The quiet dispatcher whose performance during the training exercises had been exceptional enough to warrant professional curiosity. The woman whose capabilities seemed inconsistent with her stated background, and who had deflected questions with the kind of careful precision that suggested significant experience with maintaining operational security. The notification triggered Santos's investigative instincts. Why would a small-town emergency services department be conducting background investigations on someone whose work performance had been exemplary? What had changed between the training exercises, where Sarah had demonstrated remarkable competence, and now, when she was apparently under scrutiny for unspecified concerns? Santos made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her secure phone and dialed a number that connected her to classified personnel records maintained by the Department of Defense. "I need a comprehensive file review on Sarah Catherine Mitchell," she told the duty officer. "Former military, currently civilian, flagged for background investigation by local authorities. I want everything that's not compartmentalized above my clearance level." The response came 2 hours later in a sealed envelope marked with security classifications that Santos hadn't seen outside of major federal investigations. Sarah Mitchell's actual military record was contained in 47 pages of documentation that told a story completely different from the modest administrative service that appeared in standard databases. Santos read through commendations from operations she couldn't discuss with anyone lacking appropriate clearances. Performance evaluations that described Sarah as exceptional, irreplaceable, and the gold standard for tactical communications coordination. Documentation of her role in missions that had prevented international incidents, saved American lives, and maintained operational security under circumstances that would have broken most people. The file also contained information about how Sarah's career had ended. A classified operation that had gone sideways due to political interference, leaving Sarah as the designated scapegoat for decisions made by officials with more protection and less honor. She had been quietly forced out of the military to avoid a scandal that could have embarrassed senior officials and compromised ongoing operations. Santos felt a surge of anger as she read the details. Sarah Mitchell had been one of the military's most capable communication specialists, someone whose skills had been essential to national security operations across multiple theaters. Her forced retirement represented not just individual injustice, but a loss of institutional capability that had made the country less safe. The final document in the file was Sarah's psychological evaluation from her discharge processing. The assessment described someone struggling with the transition from meaningful work to civilian life, but also noted her exceptional emotional resilience and professional competence. The psychologist had recommended that Sarah be offered opportunities to use her skills in civilian roles that could benefit from her unique background. Instead, she was working as a small-town dispatcher and being investigated as a potential security risk by people who had no understanding of her actual qualifications or service record. Santos closed the file and made another decision that would cascade through the carefully constructed barriers that Sarah had built around her new life. She placed a call to Lieutenant Colonel Peterson and Captain Chen, the other federal agents who had observed Sarah's exceptional performance during the training exercises. "We need to talk about Sarah Mitchell," Santos told them during a secure conference call. "What I'm about to share is classified, but it explains everything we observed during those exercises." Santos briefed them on Sarah's actual background, her forced retirement from military service, and the reasons she was now working under an assumed level of competence in rural Montana. Peterson and Chen listened with growing understanding as pieces of a puzzle they hadn't realized they were solving clicked into place. "That explains the tactical thinking I observed," Peterson said. "She was applying military doctrine to civilian scenarios because that's her actual training background. No wonder her performance seemed so advanced." "The question now," Chen interjected, "is why she's being investigated by local authorities. If her work performance has been exceptional, what triggered this background check?" Santos had been wondering the same thing. The timeline suggested that Sarah's problems had begun after the training exercises, which meant her demonstrated competence had somehow created difficulties rather than opportunities. "I think we need to make some calls," Santos said grimly. "If Sarah Mitchell is being harassed because she's too good at her job, That's not just wrong. It's potentially dangerous. Someone with her capabilities shouldn't be sidelined due to institutional politics. While the federal agents were discovering the truth about Sarah's background, Sarah herself was facing a crisis that threatened to destroy the emotional equilibrium she'd fought to maintain since leaving the military. The isolation of administrative leave had given her too much time to think, too many quiet hours when memories of her previous life intruded on her carefully constructed present. She found herself staring at the locked case in her bedroom closet, the one that contained documentation of who she used to be. The commendations, photographs, and identification that proved she had once been someone whose voice could guide special operations teams through hostile territory and coordinate resources that affected national security. The contrast between that person and Sarah Mitchell, suspended dispatcher under investigation for being too competent, was becoming psychologically unbearable. She had accepted exile as the price of avoiding further controversy. But watching her civilian career destroyed by the same institutional dynamics that had ended her military service was triggering anger that she'd thought she had successfully suppressed. On her 5th day of administrative leave, Sarah made a decision that would shatter the careful anonymity she'd maintained for 18 months. She opened the locked case and retrieved her old military identification card, the one that listed her actual rank, clearances, and the radio call sign that had defined her professional identity, Nighthawk 7. For the first time since moving to Montana, Sarah allowed herself to remember who she had been. Not the modest dispatcher who accepted condescension and micromanagement, but the communications specialist who had earned the absolute trust of commanders who operated at the highest levels of national security. That afternoon, Sarah drove to the emergency services building, where she was officially prohibited from entering. She parked across the street and observed the department that had systematically destroyed her civilian career, based on the assumption that competence was suspicious and excellence was threatening. She watched Hammond arrive for his afternoon shift, carrying himself with the self-important authority of someone who had never faced real responsibility or genuine consequences. She saw Morrison entering the building with files that probably contained more fabricated documentation designed to justify Sarah's termination. These people had chosen to interpret her capabilities as threats rather than assets. They had decided that maintaining their comfortable mediocrity was more important than recognizing excellence that could benefit their community. They had systematically destroyed someone who could have made their department more effective, safer, and more professional. Sarah felt the anger that she'd suppressed for months, finally breaking through the careful emotional controls she'd maintained. These provincial bureaucrats had repeated the same pattern of institutional betrayal that had ended her military career, but this time she didn't have to accept it quietly. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 18 months. A secure line that connected to federal databases where her real service record was maintained, not the sanitized version that appeared in standard background checks. "This is Sarah Mitchell," she said when the duty officer answered, "former Nighthawk 7. I need to speak with someone about reactivating my security clearances and consulting status." The response was immediate and gratifying. "Nighthawk 7, we've been hoping to hear from you. Your expertise has been missed, and there are several situations where your capabilities would be extremely valuable." Sarah felt a surge of recognition that she'd almost forgotten. The respect in the duty officer's voice, the immediate understanding of her capabilities, the assumption that she was someone whose contributions mattered. It was everything that had been missing from her civilian life. "I'm currently dealing with some local complications," Sarah said carefully, "but I may be available for consultation work if appropriate opportunities arise. We'll flag your file for immediate consideration." "Nighthawk 7, it's good to have you back in the system." Sarah ended the call, feeling more like herself than she had in months. The quiet dispatcher who accepted harassment and micromanagement was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to be valued for exceptional capabilities rather than punished for them. She didn't know that federal agents were already investigating her situation, or that her phone call had triggered alerts that would bring those agents directly into conflict with the people who had destroyed her civilian career. What she did know was that she was finished accepting institutional betrayal quietly. Sarah Mitchell had tried to disappear into small-town anonymity, but Nighthawk 7 was about to emerge from forced retirement. And when she did, the people who had underestimated her would discover exactly how dangerous it could be to dismiss someone whose true capabilities they had never bothered to understand. The breaking point had been reached. The defiance was about to begin, and Clearwater County was about to learn that some people are far more than they appear to be. The emergency began at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when seismic monitoring stations across the northern Rockies registered a 6.2 magnitude earthquake centered 12 miles southwest of Clearwater County. Within minutes, the tremor had triggered a catastrophic failure at the Glacier Creek Dam, a 70-year-old concrete structure that had been scheduled for safety upgrades but had fallen victim to budget delays and bureaucratic inertia. Sarah felt the earthquake in her apartment as a rolling motion that knocked books from shelves and set car alarms wailing throughout the complex. But it wasn't until her emergency services scanner, which she'd kept active despite her administrative leave, began crackling with frantic radio traffic that she understood the true scope of what was unfolding. All units, this is dispatch with emergency notification. Glacier Creek Dam has suffered structural failure. Repeat, the dam has failed. Flash flood conditions are imminent for the entire Clearwater Valley. This is not a drill. The voice belonged to Tracy Williams, the night shift dispatcher who had replaced Sarah during her suspension. Williams was competent enough for routine operations, but Sarah could hear the panic creeping into her voice as the magnitude of the situation became clear. This wasn't a standard emergency that could be handled with established protocols. This was a disaster that would require coordination beyond anything Clearwater County had ever attempted. Sarah moved to her window and looked toward the valley, where Glacier Creek wound through residential neighborhoods, agricultural areas, and the town's business district. In the distance, she could see emergency vehicle lights creating constellations of red and blue against the darkness, but even from her apartment she could tell that the response was chaotic and uncoordinated. Her scanner continued broadcasting updates that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The dam failure had released approximately 2.8 billion gallons of water into a drainage system designed to handle normal seasonal runoff. The flood wave was moving downstream at roughly 15 miles per hour, giving residents in the evacuation zone less than 90 minutes to reach safety before the water arrived. But the evacuation was failing catastrophically. Williams was struggling to coordinate emergency responders who were operating without clear situational awareness or unified command structure. Fire departments from 3 counties were en route but lacked common radio frequencies to communicate effectively. The National Guard had been activated, but wouldn't arrive for at least 2 hours, too late to assist with immediate evacuations. Most critically, the evacuation routes themselves were becoming compromised. Highway 287, the primary escape route for residents in the flood zone, was blocked by a landslide triggered by the earthquake. County Road 45, the only alternative, was already congested with panicked civilians whose vehicles were creating traffic jams that prevented emergency responders from reaching people who needed immediate assistance. Hopkins. Sarah listened to Williams attempting to manage a disaster that required capabilities no single dispatcher possessed. She was juggling radio traffic from 17 different agencies while trying to maintain situational awareness for an emergency that spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved thousands of people. The communication system was breaking down under the sheer volume of information, creating dangerous gaps in coordination that were preventing effective rescue operations. Dispatch, this is Fire Chief Martinez. One transmission crackled through static interference. We've got approximately 40 residents trapped in the Riverside Mobile Home Park. Water is rising faster than anticipated. We need immediate helicopter evacuation, but we can't establish contact with aviation units. Williams' response revealed the depth of the crisis. Fire Chief Martinez, I'm trying to reach aviation support, but our communication systems are overloaded. Can you repeat your exact location and number of people requiring evacuation? Sarah could hear the frustration and barely controlled panic in Williams' voice. She was doing her best, but the situation demanded expertise that went far beyond civilian emergency dispatch training. The communication failures that were preventing effective coordination would cost lives unless someone with advanced capabilities took control of the situation immediately. That's when Sarah's scanner picked up a transmission that changed everything. Any station, this is Border Patrol Agent Santos. We have a helicopter en route to assist with evacuations, but we need someone who can coordinate ground units and establish unified command protocols. Current dispatch appears to be overwhelmed. Agent Santos, the federal agent who had observed Sarah's exceptional performance during the training exercises and who had asked probing questions about her background. Santos was apparently in the area and attempting to assist with the disaster response, but she was encountering the same communication breakdowns that were hampering all rescue efforts. Sarah made a decision that would shatter 18 months of carefully maintained anonymity. She retrieved her emergency radio from the locked case in her bedroom closet, military-grade equipment that she'd kept for reasons she hadn't fully understood until this moment. The radio was capable of monitoring and transmitting on frequencies that civilian equipment couldn't access, including the tactical channels that federal agencies used for complex operations. She powered up the radio and immediately heard traffic that civilian scanners couldn't detect. Santos was coordinating with other federal agents who had responded to the disaster, but they were struggling with the same problems that were hampering local responders: inadequate situational awareness, communication system overload, and lack of unified command structure. Sarah took a deep breath and keyed her microphone, using the call sign she hadn't spoken in 18 months. Federal units responding to Glacier Creek Dam failure. This is Nighthawk 7. I have tactical communications capabilities and comprehensive situational awareness. Request permission to establish unified command network. The response was immediate and electric. Nighthawk 7, this is Agent Santos. Confirm your identity and current location. We have been trying to locate you. Sarah provided her current position and authentication codes that proved her identity beyond any doubt. Santos's response revealed that the federal agents had been actively searching for her since discovering her true background during their investigation of the harassment she'd faced from local authorities. Nighthawk 7, we are declaring emergency operational status. You are hereby activated for disaster coordination under Federal Emergency Response Authority. Take control of all communication networks and establish unified command immediately. The authorization was exactly what Sarah needed. Federal emergency response protocols superseded local authority during major disasters, giving her the legal authority to override Chief Hammond's prohibition against her involvement in emergency services operations. Sarah quickly configured her radio to monitor all relevant frequencies simultaneously: local emergency services, federal tactical channels, National Guard coordination networks, and aviation support communications. Within minutes, she had developed a comprehensive picture of the disaster that no single person in the official response had been able to achieve. The situation was worse than anyone realized. The flood wave was moving faster than initial projections. The evacuation routes were more severely compromised than local authorities understood, and there were several isolated areas where residents were trapped with no awareness that rescue operations were even being attempted. But Sarah also identified opportunities that others had missed. There were resources available that weren't being utilized effectively, coordination gaps that could be closed with proper communication protocols, and tactical solutions that could dramatically improve the evacuation success rate. She keyed her microphone and began transforming chaos into coordinated action. All units. This is Nighthawk 7 assuming tactical coordination authority under Federal Emergency Response Protocols. Acknowledge your status and stand by for unified command assignments. The response was immediate and gratifying. Every emergency responder in the field acknowledged her transmission with the kind of professional respect that Sarah hadn't experienced since leaving the military. They recognized the voice of someone who knew what she was doing, someone who could provide the coordination they desperately needed. Chief Hammond's voice cut through the radio traffic with barely controlled fury. Nighthawk 7, you are not authorized to assume command authority. You are currently suspended from emergency services and prohibited from department operations. Santos's response was swift and devastating. Chief Hammond, this is Border Patrol Agent Santos operating under Federal Disaster Authority. Nighthawk 7 is now operating under my direct authorization. Any interference with federal emergency operations will be considered obstruction of justice. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as Hammond's objections were swept aside by federal authority that superseded his local control. For 18 months, she had endured his condescension and micromanagement. Now, when lives were at stake and exceptional capabilities were required, the federal government was placing her in exactly the role her training and experience had prepared her for. All units, this is Nighthawk 7. We are implementing emergency evacuation protocols that will clear the flood zone within 60 minutes. Stand by for specific assignments and coordination frequencies. Sarah began orchestrating a rescue operation that would demonstrate exactly what she was capable of when institutional barriers were removed and her true abilities were finally unleashed. The quiet dispatcher who had accepted harassment and limitations was gone, replaced by the tactical communications specialist who had once coordinated operations that affected national security. Clearwater County was about to discover who Sarah Mitchell really was. And Chief Hammond was about to learn that some people are far more dangerous as enemies than he had ever imagined possible. The crisis that would reveal everything had begun. The catalyst was in motion. And Nighthawk 7 was back in operation, with federal authority and the motivation to prove exactly how catastrophic it had been to underestimate her capabilities. The radio call that would change everything was about to begin. The transformation that occurred over the next 90 minutes would become legendary in emergency services circles across the western United States. Sarah Mitchell, the suspended dispatcher who had been deemed unsuitable for small-town emergency work, orchestrated a disaster response operation that saved over 800 lives while coordinating resources across 4 states and 17 different agencies. Operating from her apartment with military-grade communication equipment, Sarah established herself as the central hub for all rescue operations in the Clearwater Valley. Her first priority was creating a unified communication network that could handle the massive volume of radio traffic while maintaining clear channels for critical coordination between ground units, aviation assets, and command personnel. Aviation Unit 7, this is Nighthawk 7, she transmitted to the Border Patrol helicopter that Agent Santos was coordinating. I'm designating frequency 142.375 as your primary tactical channel. Ground units in Sector 3 will monitor this frequency for direct coordination with your extraction operations. The precision and authority in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't someone learning emergency procedures. This was a professional who had managed far more complex operations under conditions where mistakes could trigger international incidents. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, who had arrived with National Guard units, immediately recognized the exceptional coordination he was receiving. Nighthawk 7, this is Guardian Base. Your tactical assignments are the most precise evacuation coordinates I've encountered in 20 years of disaster response. What's your operational background? Guardian Base. I'm former military communications with tactical coordination experience, currently operating under Federal Emergency Authority through Agent Santos. Focus on evacuation priorities. We'll discuss credentials after everyone's safe. Sarah's response was professional and deflective, but Peterson could hear the kind of calm competence that only came from extensive experience with high-stakes operations. Her coordination patterns were textbook military doctrine adapted brilliantly for civilian emergency response. The disaster unfolding in the Clearwater Valley required Sarah to demonstrate every skill she'd developed during 12 years of classified operations. She was simultaneously tracking the positions and status of 47 emergency vehicles, coordinating helicopter evacuation flights that required precise timing and landing zone preparation, and maintaining situational awareness for flood conditions that were changing rapidly as the water moved downstream. Most impressively, she was identifying and solving problems that other coordinators hadn't even recognized yet. Fire Chief Martinez, this is Nighthawk 7 with priority traffic, she transmitted to the commander struggling to evacuate the Riverside Mobile Home Park. Your current route will be underwater in 18 minutes. I'm vectoring you to alternate extraction point Delta 7. Coordinates 47.2458 north, 114.1847 west. Aviation Unit 7 is pre-positioned for immediate helicopter evacuation. Martinez's response revealed his amazement. Nighthawk 7, how did you know about the route flooding? Our spotters haven't reported that yet. I'm monitoring real-time hydrological data and projecting flood progression based on topographical analysis. The route you're using will be impassable before you can complete evacuations. Trust my guidance and move to the alternate coordinates immediately. Martinez followed her instructions, and his evacuation team reached the helicopter landing zone just as rising water began flooding their original route. 43 residents were safely airlifted to emergency shelters, including several elderly residents who would have been trapped if Martinez had continued on his original path. The level of situational awareness Sarah was maintaining went far beyond anything civilian emergency services typically attempted. She was processing information from weather monitoring stations, geological survey data, traffic management systems, and hospital capacity reports, while simultaneously coordinating active rescue operations across a disaster zone spanning 60 square miles. Mayasblee, Tracy Williams, the civilian dispatcher who had been overwhelmed by the scope of the emergency, was monitoring Sarah's coordinations with growing amazement and professional humility. Nighthawk 7, this is Clearwater Dispatch. I've never seen coordination like this. Where did you learn these techniques? Clearwater Dispatch, techniques aren't important right now. I need you to focus on hospital notifications and shelter capacity management. Let me handle tactical coordination while you manage civilian support services. Sarah's response was kind but firm, recognizing that Williams was doing her best while being completely outclassed by the operational requirements. Rather than embarrassing Williams further, Sarah was redirecting her to responsibilities that matched her actual capabilities while maintaining overall control of the complex rescue operation. But it was Sarah's coordination of a particularly dangerous rescue that finally revealed the full extent of her capabilities to everyone monitoring the radio networks. A school bus carrying 26 children from a summer camp program had become stranded on County Road 18 when the earthquake damaged a bridge that was now structurally unsafe but still passable for light vehicles. The bus was too heavy to cross safely, but floodwaters were rising rapidly toward the road level, creating a situation where the children would be trapped between an impassable bridge and rising water. The rescue required split-second timing and coordination between multiple assets: a helicopter capable of lifting children from the bus, ground units to provide security and medical support, and precise navigation in conditions where a single mistake could result in catastrophic consequences. All units, this is Nighthawk 7 with emergency rescue coordination, Sarah transmitted with the kind of absolute authority that commanded immediate attention. We have 26 children trapped on damaged bridge structure. This is a precision operation requiring exact timing and coordination. Her instructions were masterful. She vectored Aviation Unit 7 to the precise coordinates while directing ground units to establish perimeter security. She coordinated with the bus driver to prepare the children for helicopter evacuation while ensuring that medical personnel were standing by to treat anyone who might be injured during the operation. Most importantly, she was monitoring structural engineering data that showed the bridge's load capacity was deteriorating rapidly. The helicopter would have a narrow window to complete the evacuation before the bridge became too dangerous to support any weight. Aviation Unit 7, you have a 12-minute window for evacuation operations. Sarah coordinated with precision that bordered on supernatural. Bridge structural integrity is degrading due to earthquake damage. After that window, the landing zone becomes too dangerous for helicopter operations. Agent Santos, who was piloting the helicopter, responded with professional respect that everyone could hear. Nighthawk 7, your coordination is exceptional. I've worked with military communications specialists who couldn't maintain this level of situational awareness under these conditions. Aviation Unit 7, focus on the children, evacuate by age priority, youngest first. Ground units will guide each child to the helicopter. Medical personnel are standing by at Landing Zone Bravo to receive anyone requiring assistance. The evacuation proceeded with clockwork precision that saved every child, while completing the operation with 90 seconds to spare before the bridge structure became too compromised for helicopter landings. It was a masterpiece of tactical coordination that required split-second timing, comprehensive situational awareness, and the kind of decision-making capability that could only be developed through years of high-stakes operations. Chief Hammond, who had been monitoring the radio traffic from the emergency services building, finally realized the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he had suspended as unsuitable for civilian dispatch work was coordinating a disaster response operation that exceeded anything his department could have managed. Her performance was so exceptional that it was attracting attention from federal officials and military personnel who recognized capabilities that went far beyond standard emergency services training. Nighthawk 7, this is Chief Hammond, he transmitted with barely controlled desperation. I need to speak with you about resuming your position immediately. We clearly need your expertise for ongoing operations. Sarah's response was professional but devastating. Chief Hammond, I'm currently operating under federal emergency authority through Agent Santos. Any personnel discussions will need to be coordinated through federal channels after current emergency operations are concluded. The message was clear. Sarah no longer answered to Hammond's authority. The federal agents who had discovered her true background and witnessed her exceptional capabilities had effectively removed her from local control and placed her in the operational role her training and experience had prepared her for. But it was Agent Santos who delivered the final vindication that exposed Hammond's incompetence to everyone monitoring the radio networks. "All units, this is Agent Santos with operational update," she transmitted with unmistakable authority. Nighthawk 7 is a former military communications specialist with 12 years of classified operational experience. Her tactical coordination capabilities are at the highest professional levels, and she is operating under my direct federal authorization. The transmission revealed everything that Hammond had never bothered to discover about the woman he had systematically harassed and ultimately suspended. Sarah Mitchell wasn't an inexperienced civilian dispatcher who needed additional training. She was a military professional whose capabilities exceeded anything that Clearwater County Emergency Services had ever encountered. Furthermore, Santos continued with precision that cut through Hammond's authority like a laser. Any personnel actions taken against Nighthawk 7 will be reviewed by federal authorities for potential civil rights violations and obstruction of emergency operations. The threat was clear and devastating. Hammond's campaign against Sarah would now be scrutinized by federal agents, who understood her actual qualifications and could evaluate whether she had been discriminated against because of her exceptional capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson added his own assessment that completed Sarah's vindication. "Nighthawk 7, your operational coordination today has been exemplary. I'm recommending you for federal recognition and requesting information about your availability for ongoing disaster response consulting." Sarah had been transformed from a suspended civilian dispatcher under investigation to a federal asset being recruited for advanced emergency management roles. The same capabilities that Hammond had viewed as threatening were now being recognized by professionals who understood their value. The radio call that revealed everything had accomplished exactly what the title promised. Sarah's call sign had exposed her true identity, her exceptional qualifications, and the catastrophic mistake that Clearwater County had made in failing to recognize what they had. "All units, this is Nighthawk 7, Sarah transmitted as the immediate evacuation operations neared completion. "Primary rescue operations are concluding successfully. All residents in flood zone have been evacuated safely. No casualties reported from evacuation operations." The disaster that could have killed hundreds of people had been managed with precision that saved every life in the danger zone. The communication failures that had nearly caused the rescue operations to collapse had been overcome by someone whose abilities exceeded anything the local emergency services system could have provided. Sarah Mitchell had proven exactly who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing when artificial barriers were removed and her true abilities were finally recognized. The quiet acceptance of institutional harassment was over. Nighthawk 7 was back in operation, with federal backing and professional recognition that would ensure she never again had to hide her exceptional capabilities behind a facade of civilian mediocrity. 3 months after the Glacier Creek Dam disaster, Sarah Catherine Mitchell stood before a joint congressional committee investigating emergency preparedness failures across rural America. The hearing room was packed with federal officials, emergency services directors, and media representatives who had come to understand that her story represented something far larger than individual vindication. It was a case study in how institutional bias could waste critical national resources and endanger American lives. The transformation in Sarah's circumstances had been swift and comprehensive. Within days of the flood response, she had received job offers from FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, and 3 private consulting firms specializing in disaster coordination. Her temporary federal authorization had become a permanent position as Senior Emergency Communications Coordinator for the Western Regional Response Team, with authority spanning 11 states and responsibility for coordinating multi-agency responses to major disasters. But perhaps more importantly, her story had sparked a nationwide review of how emergency services departments evaluated and utilized personnel with non-traditional backgrounds. The Sarah Mitchell case, as it had become known in federal circles, demonstrated how local prejudices and institutional limitations could prevent communities from recognizing exceptional capabilities that existed within their own personnel. Committee members, Sarah testified with the confidence of someone who had found her proper place in the world, the disaster response failures in Clearwater County weren't due to lack of resources or inadequate equipment. They were caused by systematic institutional barriers that prevented qualified personnel from contributing their expertise to community safety. Representative Angela Williams from the House Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness leaned forward with interest. "Ms. Mitchell, can you elaborate on how your military background was relevant to civilian emergency services and why local officials failed to recognize these capabilities?" Sarah's answer was measured and professional, but it carried undertones that everyone in the room could understand. Representative Williams: "My military experience included coordinating tactical communications for operations across multiple countries and agencies. These skills directly transferred to civilian emergency management, but local supervisors interpreted my capabilities as evidence that I didn't fit their expectations for emergency services personnel." The subcommittee had already reviewed extensive documentation about Sarah's treatment at Clearwater County Emergency Services. Chief Hammond's systematic harassment campaign, Janet Morrison's fabricated performance reports, and the administrative investigation designed to justify Sarah's termination had all been examined by federal investigators who found clear evidence of discriminatory practices. "The irony," continued Representative Williams, "is that rural communities often struggle with recruiting qualified emergency services personnel, yet Clearwater County actively worked to eliminate someone whose capabilities exceeded their institutional requirements." Agent Santos, who was testifying alongside Sarah, provided additional context that illustrated the broader implications of the case. Representative Williams: "Our investigation revealed that Ms. Mitchell's situation isn't isolated. We've identified dozens of similar cases where former military personnel with specialized skills have been underutilized or actively discriminated against by local emergency services departments that lack the institutional knowledge to recognize advanced capabilities." The congressional hearing was being broadcast live on C-SPAN, and the coverage had attracted national attention to issues that most Americans had never considered. Social media was filled with discussions about how many qualified people might be working in positions that didn't utilize their full potential, and how institutional bias could prevent communities from accessing expertise that could save lives during emergencies. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, now working directly with Sarah on federal disaster response protocols, provided military perspective that resonated with committee members from both parties. Committee members: "The skills that Ms. Mitchell demonstrated during the Glacier Creek response are exactly the capabilities that military personnel develop through years of specialized training. When these individuals transition to civilian careers, their expertise represents a tremendous resource for community safety, if local institutions are sophisticated enough to recognize and utilize their abilities." The hearing also featured testimony from residents of Clearwater County who had been directly affected by the flood response. Maria Gonzalez, whose 3 children had been among those evacuated from the stranded school bus, spoke with emotion that brought several committee members to tears. "Ms. Mitchell saved my children's lives," Gonzalez testified, her voice breaking with gratitude. "But the same people who had suspended her from her job were the ones who almost prevented her from helping when we needed her most. How many other communities are making the same mistake right now?" The question hung in the hearing room like a challenge that demanded institutional reform. How many qualified people were being overlooked, underutilized, or actively discriminated against because their capabilities didn't match local expectations or threatened established hierarchies? Back in Montana, the consequences for those who had systematically undermined Sarah were swift and comprehensive. Chief Hammond had been terminated following a federal investigation that found evidence of discriminatory practices, abuse of authority, and obstruction of emergency operations. His replacement was Captain Rebecca Torres, a former military officer who had been recruited specifically to reform Clearwater County's emergency services culture. Janet Morrison had resigned rather than face a formal disciplinary hearing, but not before a federal audit revealed that her documentation practices had created liability exposure that could have cost the county millions in wrongful termination lawsuits. Her position had been eliminated entirely, with her responsibilities redistributed to supervisors who had received extensive training in recognizing and developing diverse talent. The emergency services building that had once felt like enemy territory to Sarah had been renamed the Sarah Mitchell Emergency Coordination Center, acknowledging her contributions to improving disaster response capabilities across the region. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had been deemed unsuitable for civilian dispatch work now had a federal emergency services facility named in her honor. But the changes went far beyond individual accountability. The entire emergency services system in Montana had been reformed based on lessons learned from the Glacier Creek disaster and Sarah's subsequent advocacy for institutional improvement. New hiring practices required emergency services departments to conduct comprehensive skills assessments that looked beyond traditional backgrounds to identify qualified candidates from military, technical, and other specialized fields. Training programs were established to help local supervisors recognize and develop advanced capabilities rather than viewing them as threats to established authority. Most importantly, federal oversight mechanisms were implemented to ensure that emergency services departments couldn't discriminate against personnel whose abilities exceeded local institutional comfort levels. The Sarah Mitchell Protocols, as they became known, created pathways for qualified individuals to appeal to federal authorities when local bias prevented them from contributing their expertise to community safety. Sarah's own career trajectory had exceeded anything she could have imagined during those dark months of administrative leave and systematic harassment. Her federal position carried authority that spanned multiple states and included responsibility for coordinating responses to major disasters that could affect millions of people. She had also become a sought-after speaker at emergency services conferences, where her presentations on institutional bias and talent recognition drew standing ovations from audiences who understood how easily they could make the same mistakes that had nearly cost Clearwater County hundreds of lives. "The lesson isn't about my individual story," Sarah would tell these audiences with the authority of someone who had lived through institutional betrayal and emerged stronger. "The lesson is about how many qualified people are sitting in your organizations right now, being underutilized because they don't fit your expectations, or because their capabilities make others feel threatened." During one particularly memorable conference presentation, Sarah had shared a photograph from her military service, the first time she had publicly displayed images from her classified career. The photo showed her coordinating communications during a joint international operation, surrounded by equipment and personnel representing the kind of high-stakes environment where her skills had been developed. "This is who I was before I became a small-town dispatcher," she had told the audience. The question every emergency services leader should ask is, who else in your organization might have backgrounds and capabilities that you've never bothered to discover? The transformation in how Sarah viewed her own career had been equally dramatic. The shame and defeat that had characterized her transition to civilian life had been replaced by purpose and recognition that her unique combination of military expertise and civilian emergency services experience made her invaluable for improving disaster response capabilities nationwide. She had also found personal satisfaction in mentoring other former military personnel who were struggling with similar transitions to civilian emergency services careers. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation, established with support from federal agencies and private donors, provided training and placement assistance for veterans whose specialized skills could benefit community safety, but who faced institutional barriers to recognition and advancement. The Foundation's most successful program paired experienced veterans with emergency services departments that had committed to comprehensive talent utilization initiatives. The results had been remarkable: improved response times, enhanced coordination capabilities, and measurably better outcomes during actual emergency situations. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Sarah's transformation was how it had changed her relationship with her own identity. For 18 months, she had tried to become someone smaller and less capable than she actually was, accepting limitations and harassment rather than risking the exposure that could threaten her carefully constructed anonymity. The crisis that forced her to reveal her true capabilities had taught her that hiding exceptional abilities was not just personally destructive, it was potentially dangerous to the communities that needed those capabilities during emergencies. Sarah kept her old emergency services identification card from Clearwater County in her federal office, not as a memento of happier times, but as a reminder of how institutions could waste human potential when they prioritized comfort over competence and conformity over capability. The radio call sign that had defined her military career, Nighthawk 7, was now painted on the side of her federal response vehicle, visible to everyone who worked with her and symbolic of the integration between her military background and civilian emergency services mission. The story that had begun with exceptional talent being forced into invisibility had concluded with that talent being recognized, developed, and utilized at the highest levels of national emergency preparedness. Sarah Mitchell had proven that excellence couldn't be hidden indefinitely, and that institutional bias was not just morally wrong but operationally dangerous. The radio call that revealed everything had changed not just one person's career, but an entire system's approach to recognizing and utilizing the extraordinary capabilities that existed within ordinary communities. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins with someone finally being allowed to show the world who they really are. Sarah Catherine Mitchell, Nighthawk 7, had found her place in the sky, and she was using it to ensure that others would never again be forced to hide their light under the bushel of institutional limitation and bureaucratic fear. The lasting impact would be measured not just in lives saved, but in potential realized and excellence finally allowed to flourish without apology or limitation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.